Welcome to Perspective and Potential, where we explore thoughtful ways to navigate life, strengthen families, and grow into who we're becoming. I'm Abigail Straight, joined by my co-host and mother, Gwen Fund, and together we'll explore ideas and stories through honest conversations about personal growth, faith, and the everyday choices that shape our lives, inviting you to grow, shift your perspective, and step more fully into who you're becoming. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can check us out at perspectiveandpotential.com. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in and see where a new perspective might take you. There are seasons in life where it feels like something has fallen apart faster than we ever imagined it could. Maybe it's a relationship or trust. Sometimes it's our health, expectation, plans, or simply just the version of life that we thought we were building comes crashing down. One of the difficult truths about rebuilding is that it's usually slower than the destruction was. It takes patience to restore what has been neglected or damaged or broken down over time. And as we study the stories of reform and rebuilding in Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, I think how intentional that process was. They didn't just rush to make everything look functional again. They were rebuilding with purpose. As many of us are likely in the process of rebuilding something in our personal life right now, the question becomes, what kind of foundation are we laying this time? And also, when we are in seasons of extreme change involving disappointment or loss, what does rebuilding look like after that?
First thing, I think all of us should see any situation like that as an opportunity for growth and learning, because resentment will never solve that problem. It'll just escalate the pain that's associated with the loss. But if we take a look at the situation with curiosity and look for understanding, we can begin that rebuilding process with fresh eyes and a better idea of maybe what we're really trying to accomplish. Because the truth is, something went wrong. And what was our part in that loss, if we had one? Did we actively do something that we shouldn't have? Or maybe did we not see or prepare for outside possibilities? Were we trying to accomplish something outside our power to do? And because, that's our first step. We research the whys of how it fell apart. What was lacking? Where was that initial weak link? And can it be repaired? Or maybe do we need to start over? Or maybe do we even need to design completely differently? So step 2 then becomes new planning. How do we rebuild better so that same thing doesn't happen again? And if we've done our research well, we know where our deficits might be, so we can work on strengthening those things. And we'll be more aware of maybe the impacts that happened from the outside. So in those cases, we need to put in boundaries or maybe safeguards for the future. Now, in the book of Nehemiah, we can see this concept kind of played out because Nehemiah is really saddened when he hears that Jerusalem has been laid waste and that all of his kinsmen have been scattered all over the region. And he goes to the Lord in prayer and confesses his grief and also the sins that his people had committed that kind of led to this disastrous failure. And he is feeling such sorrow and helplessness because he too has been scattered. But by doing this, he brings in the most important step in rebuilding anything. And that's bringing God in as a consultant on the new build. Because our vision is really finite, but his is not. And as we seek his guidance and inspiration, he can bless us with a lot of details that maybe we don't even see. And he can give us insight on whether or not it can be rebuilt, or whether we need to direct our efforts in a different direction. And he can also enable us with blessings that we might need to succeed. And really and truly, following this framework, it can be applied to any kind of a problem, whether it's a family, work problem, personal growth, parenting, or maybe social responsibility. And sometimes, if we're headed in the wrong direction, we just won't get that blessing that we keep hoping for. Now, God was able to use Nehemiah's righteous desires and his relationship with the king to start this chain of miracles that resulted in the restoration of Jerusalem and the gathering of the children of Israel back into a strong, cohesive group. Now, our rebuilds probably are not that grand in scale, but to our long-term happiness, they really are that important.
I love what you said about bringing him in as a consultant, because to me, I think that says a couple of things. First, a consultant guides and advises, but ultimately still allows the person to choose what they're going to do. And I think that's such an important part of our relationship with God. He gives us agency.
Mhm.
He's not forcing us into decisions, but at the same time, just like a really good consultant, he has experience, he has perspective, he has the vision that we simply just don't have. And he can see the weak spots that we miss, or the long-term impacts that we're not thinking about, and the outcomes that are possible if we trust him and if we trust the process. So we'd honestly be crazy not to lean into that kind of guidance. But I also think that bringing God into the rebuilding process changes the spirit of how we rebuild. Because instead of building out of resentment or fear or desperation to just get back to what we've lost, it shifts into asking the better questions like, what is this trying to teach me? What needs to be stronger this time? Sometimes disappointment exposes cracks that we didn't even realize were there. And while that's painful, it also gives us the opportunity to rebuild more intentionally instead of just recreating the same thing. I also love how God is kind of like the ultimate puzzle builder. He sees this never ceases to amaze me, but he sees the connections that we don't see yet. When we commit to the work and we stay willing to learn and continually consult with him, he has a way of putting people or opportunities or experiences into place in ways that only ever make sense later. And a lot of times the rebuilding isn't just about us. It's the things that we learn through the loss, through rebuilding and healing, eventually becomes the very thing that allows us to support, strengthen, and serve other people who go through those hard seasons too. I think some of the most important rebuilding we ever do happens inside our own homes, and inside of our relationships, because conflict and disappointment and hurt and misunderstanding actually happen in every single family at some point. So that leads into my next question, which is, how do families actually restore trust after conflict? And what practices help create real renewal in the home instead of just moving on without truly healing?
Well, trust once broken honestly just has to be earned back. It's not something somebody just gives you arbitrarily. And it's almost always a slow process. And that process has to begin by us rebuilding ourselves back into a trustworthy person. If we've broken a trust, we have to take that.
Mm-hmm.
We have to take that responsibility. And using all these principles that we just talked about, we examine our own selves first to find where we failed to stand firm and faithful. And then we plan and rebuild better and stronger resolve within ourselves and in our relationship with God, who can give us that greater strength going forward to resist or to overcome those weaknesses that caused us to break trust in the first place. Because only then, only after we have done that homework and put those things in motion, can we begin the process of earning back the trust from others through repeatedly showing up humbly and faithfully, being fully transparent, and owning and never excusing the responsibility for the damage that we've done. And we have to be willing to go the extra mile um, as others process their own hurt and anger. We have to respect those boundaries that they need in order to feel safe until they can gradually reduce them and let you come a little closer. Now, it's interesting. There's a book called The Five Languages of Apology. And so you think, well, I said I was sorry, right? But really, people need different things and different people need different things. So this Five Languages of Apology by David Hartman, I think, the one, of course, is expressing regret. Oh, I'm really sorry. We learn that when we're 3 years old, right? Tell your brother you're sorry. Right. But number two, some people actually need to hear you accept responsibility. They need to know that you know what you did, what it was that caused the pain. Number three, some people want restitution. You got to make it up to me. This is what it cost me, and this is what I need in order, to feel like I can trust you again. Number four, that plan for change. I know that this is what I did that really hurt you. And from now on, this is what I plan to do to make sure that never happens again. And then the last one, some people just want you to ask, can you ever forgive me? Will you please forgive me? So they need, some form of these five things in order to get to that point where they feel like they can forgive. So learning how to forgive ourselves and one another in the language that we actually need to hear. And I want to say too, forgiving ourselves. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, right? We realize and we've taken responsibility, and then we just play that over and over and over again in our minds. But when we've done the work to make ourselves a trustworthy person again, then we can also forgive ourselves, realizing that we were human and we made mistakes and that we can change. So, Nehemiah and the children of Israel, they had to do a whole lot of repenting, and they had to make a whole lot of changes in how they were doing things in order to receive those blessings that they wanted so badly. They had to work hard. And even in the face of opposition, they slept on their swords because there were people who were trying to, prevent them from doing the things they needed to do. But they persisted until the build was complete. And maybe we're going to have to do the same.
I want to go back to what you said about being willing to go the extra mile as others are processing their hurt and anger, because I think that is a really underrated quality in our world, where sometimes when we are expecting the apology, right? or we feel like that we've been the one that's been wronged, or we 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 live in a world that tells people, well, that's their problem, or you apologize, so they should just move on, right? It's kind of that that time piece, that patience piece.
It's like the fast food service.
Yes.
Just, I did it. I'm sorry. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, right. But real rebuilding doesn't work that way. Hurt has a process. And like you said, trust has a process. And that just takes time. And if we aren't willing to do the work to get there, we're not going to achieve, the outcome that we're really looking for. I think one of the hardest, but one of the most mature things that a person can do is to choose not to react defensively when someone else is reacting emotionally. And that can be hard, especially if it's people that we're close to. Um, but it is possible. It is possible to choose not to react emotionally. And also, I think there's maybe this perception that if you don't stand back up for yourself, then you're a victim. But I think that's actually a far cry from reality. When others respond in anger, distance, or frustration or caution, we can choose humility over pride. We can choose patience instead of demanding instant forgiveness. We can choose to stay steady instead of making their healing process about our own discomfort.
And if I could interject here, when someone puts up a boundary, they're not necessarily being mean or trying to hurt you back.
Mm-hmm.
A boundary is a defense. There are people who, there's a big thing on all the news and stuff right now where they talk about how many young people are cutting their parents off.
Mm.
And like it's a terrible thing. But if you have any person, a parent, a sibling, a neighbor who's toxic and who
Yeah.
constantly breeds this negative toxicity into your life, you do not have to accommodate that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think though there's different kinds of hurt or actions where somebody might have these toxic habits where other people, I think what I'm referring to is maybe made a choice that hurt us in the moment. And we don't have to always respond. We can choose, like, hey, is that out of character for them? This is not usual behavior. Can I give the patience because they're going through something in this moment? And now I can show that, you know what, even though you hurt me in the moment, I recognize that you're working through something, and
Yeah.
I am going to show that patience because I recognize that there's other things going on, right? And I think that's what I mean by that humility. We don't have to be proud in the moment. We can also just go, okay, I recognize that there's other things, and it's probably not actually about me.
But I think on the flip side too, if people are putting up boundaries with us, we need to do some self-exploration to see if maybe there's a reason for those
Yeah.
boundaries. Maybe we're behaving in a way that causes some hurt or emotional distress to people. So I always like to say, how are we ever going to know, or how would anybody ever know that they had a problem if there were no consequences?
And that's part of, I think, the part that can be challenging too is being willing to let the other person know what it was that hurt you, right? Because it can actually be easier to just cut them out. And are we creating a boundary, or are we cutting people out? And it's also a matter of how hard do we want to work on repairing that relationship, or are we at a point where it's not a healthy relationship?
And so it does take two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I think overall it makes me think of this old story about the cracked bell. A church bell had developed a crack, and every time it rang, the sound came out distorted. And so the townspeople argued over whether it should just be melted down and replaced. Um, but the bell maker said something interesting. He said the problem wasn't solved by striking it harder or demanding that it sound normal again. The metal first had to be heated, repaired, reshaped, and strengthened before it could ring clearly again. And during that process, it was fragile for a while. And I think people are a lot like that after hurt. Sometimes we expect relationships to go immediately back to normal after trust has been damaged. But healing usually requires patience, consistency, and care. You can't force trust to return by demanding it or rushing the process. And that's kind of how we become a little bit more like God in our relationships. He's patient with us while we grow, while we heal, while we learn. He doesn't immediately discard us when we fall short, and when we learn to extend that same steadiness and grace to the people we love, especially in families. I think it creates space for real healing and renewal to happen over time. Let's shift maybe just a little bit and talk about how do we discover what part of our life, like you were talking about, is asking for a reset.
Well, we start by looking at where we feel weak or disconnected. Um, is that with a particular person? Or maybe a friend, a family member, or a colleague? Or maybe we feel some disconnection in our jobs, or maybe our standard of living, or with our current goals. Sometimes we feel that disconnection with ourselves, not even knowing who we are or what we want, or sometimes with God. And that brings us right back to that step one of the process, curiosity and research. In my own life, this is where I jump to the Heavenly Father consultant in prayer, because life can really get so overwhelming that it's really hard to find the exact cause of our discomfort, because so many of those disconnections can be present at the same time. So I know that I need my Heavenly Father's connection to function so I can kind of sort the rest out. So I pray, I study His words, go to church, I get out and serve someone, uh, and then I go home and I examine the disconnection within myself, because I believe that those are the two main connections that guide my choices. When I know who I want to be, and I also know who He wants me to be. And when I can line those two things up, then, then I can get on with making choices that take me in that direction. And other people's choices, they're also going to play a part in our connection in the form of boundaries that either we have to set or that they have set, because all power lies within us. And we can't choose other people's choices. So we have to adapt our course in life to accommodate the boundaries that we encounter or set. And of course, that includes the boundaries that our loving Father in heaven has given us. As we learn to stay within His wise admonitions, we strengthen our connection with Him and with ourselves as we, function as a child of God. And then everything else suddenly becomes easier to accomplish or to endure.
I really like what you said there about how discomfort is often a signal of disconnection. I think a lot of times people immediately try to numb discomfort or escape it, distract themselves from it, or just blame someone else instead of getting curious about what it might actually be revealing. And sometimes the reason we feel restless or frustrated, emotionally exhausted, or unsettled is because something important in our life is out of alignment. And maybe we've drifted from our connection with God. Maybe we're overcommitted or disconnected from our families. We're avoiding hard conversations or chasing goals that no longer fit the season that we're in. And I think that's why honest self reflection matters so much. Not reflection that's rooted in shame. That's not what I'm talking about, but reflection that is rooted really in clarity. Because you can't rebuild intentionally if you refuse to honestly identify what's broken, what's weak, what's disconnected or neglected. And sometimes the reset is not about tearing your whole life apart. Sometimes it's about the small course corrections repeated consistently over time.
Absolutely.
Probably the biggest takeaway from this whole conversation is that rebuilding is rarely instant. Most of the time, it happens through humble reflection, steady effort, and a willingness to let God help guide the process. Whether it's rebuilding trust, rebuilding faith, rebuilding family relationships, or rebuilding ourselves after disappointment or loss, the process usually starts the same way, slowing down long enough to recognize that this needs attention and then being willing to begin again with greater wisdom than before. Every life will eventually go through seasons where something cracks or shifts or falls apart and needs to be rebuilt. Sometimes that's intentional. But that doesn't mean that the story's over. Sometimes it's actually the beginning of building something stronger, wiser, healthier, and more grounded than what existed before. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, please be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Your input helps shape the conversation and makes perspective and potential even more impactful. We're Gwen and Abby, and you've been listening to Perspective and Potential. Until next time, keep exploring new perspectives, and remember that every small change can lead to something big. Food for thought.
Bon appetit.